Hey everybody, welcome back. Okay, so we're finally going to take a look at the medieval world. We're particularly going to talk about this guy named Charlemagne. And when we're thinking about the medieval world, there's some things that come to mind. So we're looking at the period after the decline or disappearance or fall of Rome. So some people would say that the Middle Ages is about the year 400 to maybe the year 1000. We're only really going up to the year 1000, but some people would even put it as 400 to 1400, so a period of about 1,000 years, because that's when things start changing in Europe. But we should remember that when we're talking about this time period, what we're really talking about is mostly Europe. And on top of that, not really Europe as in Italy and Greece, but more Europe as in Germany and France and Britain, because those countries end up becoming more powerful in later history. And so we focus on them quite a bit more. And so we have this tendency in our culture to think all the world was just really bad during this time period, that everything was bad and, it was the end of an era and civilization was down the toilet. And there's a couple problems with thinking of that way. One of them is we're just talking about Europe here. So even if Europe was having a hard time, that doesn't necessarily mean that other parts of the world were having a hard time. For instance, we know for a fact, we just looked at the civilizations that are Islamic, the caliphates in Baghdad and North Africa and Spain. Like I said, they're doing pretty darn well. They're doing a lot of science. If you like science, they're doing a lot of philosophy and art and building beautiful buildings and things like that. All the things that we really celebrated about Greece and Rome, that's still going on in Baghdad and Cairo and Cordoba in Spain. And then meanwhile, China is doing just fine. China is flourishing, as we're going to see next time we talk about China, which I think is in like a week or so. China's got it made and inventing all sorts of cool stuff, having a good time, having a very productive time. So those things are still happening in other parts of the world. And then on top of that, just because we don't have those things as much in Europe doesn't necessarily mean it's a period of decline. So there's a lot of debate over whether we should call the Middle Ages or the medieval period as a negative time in Europe, even if we just limit it to Europe. Was it a bad time? Well, there's a lot to consider here. It does seem like you have a lot less of the sort of education, a lot less people trying to do philosophy and science and things like that. So if that's what you're motivated by, then that's kind of disappointing. And in a certain sense, that kind of new scientific stuff that Rome was doing a lot of, and Greece was doing a lot of, that kind of ground to a halt. That's true. But on the other hand, it might not have been a bad time to be alive. Like the Greek Dark Ages, we have this sort of confusion where dark could mean that it's dark to us, right? Because there's definitely way less writing. So historians have trouble shining a light on it. That's one thing that dark could mean. But, when people have talked about the Dark Ages, what image does that bring to your minds? Probably a pretty negative one, right? People living in poverty and muddy huts and things like that, and not a good time. Well, that may not have been super true either. It seems like it's more that the sort of the power structures of Rome fell apart, and so we didn't have those anymore in Europe during the Middle Ages. But that doesn't necessarily mean life was bad for any individual person. Like I said, it might have just been a change of kings. You used to be a farmer who paid taxes to Romulus in Rome, and now you're a farmer who pays tax money to a German king who rules over you. So, on a day-to-day level, for a lot of people, it might not have been that bad. So looking at this issue in a little bit more detail, like I said, there's this sort of ambiguity between whether Dark Age means there's less writing and less information on it, or is it a Dark Age meaning it's a bad time to be alive? And I think these days we tend to think it's less bad than we used to think. Um, there was something else I was going to say. Oh, well, I guess there is still some writing going on, but it's limited to a very small group of people. And these people are the clergy, the church. The church has a lot of power, and the church is going to become known as the Catholic Church eventually, operating out of Rome. And it's these folks who are educated, but they don't learn to read and write, German languages or French or anything like that. They learn to read and write Latin, which used to be the language of the people who were in charge. It still kind of is, but what they're in charge of is just limited to the church. But I should mention that monks are copying a lot of philosophy and science and history and even old mythology type of stuff. All that is being copied by monks into Latin and copied again and again by people who consider it interesting or valuable. Even, the comedies from Greece with dirty jokes in them, there's still monks who consider those worth, preserving and keeping around, which is pretty cool. So something to think about there. But I guess one way to think about all this is if you're familiar with games that are set in sort of a medieval period, because medieval is very closely tied to fantasy and the way we think about fantasy. I think one interesting way of thinking about this can be, was the medieval period more like The Legend of Zelda, or was it more like Dark Souls? And I'll explain what I mean by this. So you've basically got two different depictions of what a medieval society could be like. And they both draw on a lot on sort of the same imagery of something is gone, but they go about it in very different ways. It's used to think that that the Middle Ages was more like Dark Souls, and that's of course exactly how they phrased it. They said it's exactly like Dark Souls, and I'll explain what I mean by this. What I mean is that it was a nasty time to be alive. Everybody was zombies. There were barbarians who overran the place, and things were constantly getting destroyed, and people were constantly dying of disease and plague. That was sort of the image people used to have, that it was ruins of civilization, and just you had to fight for every inch of your existence, and it was just a general crappy time to be alive. That's how people used to think about it. Today, I would say historians think of it much more like The Legend of Zelda. So in the most recent Legend of Zelda game, the Zelda games have always been medieval in various ways, but this one I feel like kind of captures some of the modern way that we think about the medieval transition. So I think historians today would say the Middle Ages was a transition from the center to the edges. That Rome used to be the center of power that was running everything. And then later we had other centers of power, like Ravenna and whatnot. But we still had sort of concentrated power in Italy and other important parts of the empire. The centers of power changed and went to different places. And I think it's a very similar story, if I want to zoom in a little bit here, in a latest Legend of Zelda game, in which, you appear as protagonist Link after this great calamity, destruction. But the destruction in the game has really mostly taken place in the central area. So in the central area, things have gotten overrun, the buildings are destroyed, things have fallen into ruin, and yeah, that is super tragic. But then when you go to the other cultures who are living on the edge of the map, you see that they escaped destruction. You've got the Gorons and the Rito and so on and so forth. These different towns escaped destruction and are all generally doing pretty well for themselves because they were outside of the range of sort of the original decline. And so these become the new centers of power, the new places that are significant. And it's sort of implied that any future growth will kind of come from them, from the central castle, which is overrun by monsters. So I think that's sort of more like what we think is that the power structures in Italy completely changed, and the power structures of the Roman Empire completely went out the window. But we still had these smaller centers of power surviving, and in some cases becoming more and more significant. I should also mention that trade networks continued, that people could trade as far away as the caliphates, even when they were in the middle of Germany. They could receive art all the way from that part of the world. So even though to some degree trade and economic stuff definitely declined, it didn't disappear completely. In fact, I think in no era does it ever really disappear completely. So yeah, think about that. In certain parts of the former empire, there would have been a lot of ruins, but not everywhere. But there would have been a legacy for many people. the closer they were to the center of power. They would have felt their life was that there had been something that was big and significant and beautiful. You had these remains of giant buildings that were crumbling into disrepair. They would have, recognized those and sort of lived around them. So that would have affected how they thought about things. So there was kind of this feeling that something had been lost, and they were trying to figure out where they stood in a lot of cases, especially if you go into places like Italy. What we see, which is really interesting, is people building their houses kind of among the remains of all this. For instance, one thing that's notable is we kind of looked at what the center of the city of Rome was. This was the old center of power. Well, the center of power shifts because what's over here? It's the Vatican. So this was the hill known as the Hill Vaticanus, or Vaticanus, I should say, which means the hill of the fortune tellers. It was also known as the Hill of the Prostitutes. We should all be glad that they went with the other option. But it was across the river on this other hill that was, outside of town because that's where Christians were originally. They were outsiders. They were outcasts. But when that became the most important building in the whole area of Rome, people started visiting it more and more often. So that meant that the place where people were living more ended up being over here in this sort of marshy area known as the Campus Martius. So this is now the exact center of downtown Rome, and the old stuff is kind of over to the side a little bit if you look at Rome today. So that's pretty cool. And then, people were living in the ruins. So this is a Roman forum, I think the Forum of Nerva. This was built by an emperor. And now, during the Middle Ages, people are just putting up their houses in here, They're keeping sheep and goats. It's a pretty compelling image, I think. There's other buildings where like it used to be a theater and you can see the sort of round wall of the theater, but now it's a totally different building. It's more like a place where a bunch of people live, kind of like an apartment complex rather than a theater. And it's still around today, but one wall of it comes from the Roman period. So all that's a lot of interesting stuff to think about. How people, had this legacy that they were living in, but they didn't necessarily feel like their lives were bad, but they did have a sense that there was something that had used to exist and was no longer around. A lot like the Greeks did after the decline of the Mycenaeans. This is kind of what the world looks like, and I'm going to explain a little bit more about that. But we've got the Byzantine Empire over here. We've got some Bulgarian Empire kind of starting. I'm not going to go into that in super much detail, but something to look into. We've got various cultures around here that haven't really officially kind of made their mark on history yet. But Britain is basically coming together. And like I said, the Byzantines over here. And we've got the caliphates in Spain and North Africa. And then we've got the Frankish Empire, which is ruled out of a place called Aachen. This is kind of the territory of both France and Germany, as you can kind of see here. Kind of divide the line down the middle here. So both French and German folks consider themselves their ancestors being the Franks. And so this culture of the Franks is going to be really significant for rethinking about European history. And what is even the concept of Europe is going to be really influenced by the people over here. At one point, they're able to reach down and take Rome, but not the rest of Italy, notably. But who are these Franks, and what's their deal? We'll go into them. Oh, but here we have another map. You can see Cordoba in Spain, Cairo in Egypt, Baghdad in basically Iraq or Mesopotamia, and then Mecca here, of course, because that's the Islamic Holy Land. So we used to have it so this was all one Roman Empire right here, sort of this circle around. But now we have effectively two things. We have European cultures up here, and we have African and West Asian, you might say Near Eastern, Middle Eastern cultures over here. But really, it's mainly this difference of religion that is causing people to start thinking of them as different cultures. And I want to go into a little bit more about that when we talk about the Franks and this guy named Charlemagne. Okay, see you in the next video.